And here we are. Welcome everyone to the Type and Culture, What Can They Teach Us webinar. Yay! Okay. I'd like to know, first of all, actually, if you could use the chat window to write in a couple of responses of how you found out about this webinar. Was it a tweet? Was it a Facebook? Or was it a LinkedIn group response? That would be interesting to know. LinkedIn. Okay, any particular group within LinkedIn that we are both members of, perhaps? Type and Culture, MBTI, okay. Cross-cultural, okay, excellent. Well, good. So I know that that's a good place to reach people, and I'll make sure to use that again in the future. So for those of you who have not used Meeting Burner before, oh, hi, Janet from OPP. So good to have you. OPP is the European arm of the Consultant Psychologies Press that holds the trademark and the license for all the MBTI products. So I'm very glad to have you. That's great. A couple of comments. The chat window on the left will be for you to write your comments and communicate with me, especially if you are listening through the listen button, and because I have the telephone lines muted to ensure a clean recording, and then I will read out the chats as I see them and as the answers come in. And there is a Q&A button on the top left-hand side for questions that you have for me. We will pause a couple of times throughout the presentation and look at the questions there, and then I'll do my best to answer them. Okay? So to get us started, here's a little information about me, because I don't know you all. I know a few of you, but I don't know all of you. So just to give you some background very briefly, I was born and raised in Germany and have been an expat going on 15 years now. I went to the university in Stirling in Scotland and got my bachelor's in HR management in Spanish. And then I went and worked in London for a bit, followed by 4 years in Barcelona and Spain. And I became an accompanying spouse when my husband's career took us to the Canary Islands and to Mexico. And I didn't have a work permit there, so that's when I decided to study coaching and become my own boss, really use my international experience. We arrived in the USA, in Texas, in 2007. And now I help expats feel at home abroad faster and show teams how to use interaction styles and temperament, personality type, and cognitive preferences to be more effective. My business is called Building the Life You Want, LLC. So I'm an expat coach and a cross-cultural trainer, and I hold certifications in MBTI, the neuroscience of type, and the Barron's Core method. If you are in a place where you would like to use Twitter on the side, you can see it in the top line there. My handle is expats_MBTI, and if you'd like to tweet any nuggets that you hear or thoughts that you like, please go ahead and do so. I just ask you to use my handle or hashtag type or hashtag culture so that I can maybe follow up with that afterwards and see what everybody was saying, okay? So to get to know you guys a little bit, does everybody know their type? And if so, can you please write that in the chat window if you're happy to share? ESTJ, ENTP, ENFP, okay. If you don't know your type, that's fine too. Can you let me know if you don't know your type? Because we'll definitely, okay, that's great. We'll definitely go over the we'll go over the basics again, so just to refresh everybody's memories, because that happens. I mean, the MBTI is a tool that people use a lot in universities and organizations, but yeah, it gets confusing. And then I'd also like to know where you're originally from and where you're currently living. Okay, so we have from Denmark, Portugal, Iowa, from San Diego, lives in San Diego, but from Okinawa. Okay, excellent. And then originally from India, and moved somewhere else now, I'm guessing. From Germany over China, now back in Germany, and the audio is cutting out. Okay, I'm sorry, that might be the internet connection. See if you can close any other programs that you have open right now. Okay, from the US going to the UK, to France, to Mexico, to Poland, and back to the US. Wow, well done. And from Portugal and Portugal, from Denmark and Denmark, that's great. From India going to Kentucky, and type as well, ENDJ. Here we go. So lots of extroverts and lots of T's in the mix, a couple of F's as well. Okay, I think we have a good temperament distribution here. Okay, well, wonderful. Anyone else would like to share? Okay. My objective for today, one more. 2 months in California, but usually in Japan. Okay. So we have some US in here, some Europe, and some Asia. So I'll make sure to tailor the stuff that we talk about a little bit to those broad areas to make this relevant for you, ideally. Okay. But my objective for today is to show how people from the same country and the same culture behave differently according to how their brains are wired. That is the type aspect. And also how people from different cultures behave differently according to the value systems they've learned or the belief systems they've had, and that would be the culture aspect. And if that sounds complicated, it's because it is, because we're complex human beings, right? So you may have seen that Hofstede's pyramid before of the 3 levels of uniqueness in human mental programming, where he says that we all have an inherited universal human nature. On top of that, we have learned a culture that is specific to our group. And on top of that, we have inherited and learned a personality that is specific to us individually. So that would be your 4-letter type code if you have it. And this is a great start trying to understand what makes us unique, but I'd like to take that even a bit further, because we are so complex. I think we're made up of many more moving parts, and it can be challenging to pin anything down long enough to be defined. So I'd say personality and cultures are even only part of the whole picture. We also have to take into account how we developed, whether our personality preferences were nurtured and encouraged in the culture that we grew up in, or whether we had to change to adapt. So our upbringing plays a big role as well. Who are our parents? Where did they grow up? What are their types and cultural preferences? And our education, experiences, and environment also have an influence on who we come to be, just like the skills that we own and that we are drawn to. So I'd like to take a moment to stress here that when we talk about personality or cultural preferences, it can sound like putting labels on people or stereotyping. And that's not the intention. As we move through these slides today, do keep in mind that everyone can use all of the differences and all of the preferences depending on the context that we're in. And that preference simply means that although you can switch, one side of the dimension will simply come easier and more naturally to you. Okay? All right. So personality, let's start by looking at type and refresh the knowledge for some of you. The type language I use is based on Carl Gustav Jung's books, as well as Dr. Linda Behrens' core certification and Dr. Dario Nardi's neuroscience personality certifications I went through, and Susan Nash's webinars that I've attended. And no worries about the names. You'll find them again on the resources slide. I have a slide with all the books that I've put together for you, okay? So Jung was a practicing psychiatrist and psychologist when the professions were still being defined, as you can see there, early 20th century is what we're looking at. And through his work with hundreds of people, he made some undeniable observations. He found that people are different in where they direct their mental energy. When presented with a new object or a new person, some people's energy flows outward to the external world, while other people's energies flow inward first. So we call this a mental attitude, and the attitudes are extroversion and introversion. Yes, the slides should be moving. Are they moving? Does everybody see the extroversion and introversion now? Yes. So he called this mental attitude, and the attitudes are extroversion and introversion. Extroversion does not mean obnoxious or talks too much, just like introversion does not mean shy or secretive. And if the slides are not moving forward for you, maybe give it a moment and try and close any other applications or programs that you might have open, because that is competing for bandwidth right now. Okay. So if you're unsure about your energy preference, just for those who don't know their type, to maybe try and self-sort, there are a few common descriptions that usually fit. Many people with preferences for extroversion are more likely to enjoy spending time with other people, or working in a group, or thinking out loud. And the thought of spending a week's holidays in the middle of nowhere without internet access would probably make them a little nervous. Okay, and if you're laughing now, that's good. And people with preferences for introversion are more likely to enjoy spending time by themselves or with one or two close friends, working by themselves, reading, and thinking before they speak. The thought of spending a week's holidays on a party cruise ship with nowhere to go and unwind would probably make them nervous. And I do know that we have a couple of introverts here, so I hope that is a good description. So if you're comfortable to share, those of you who don't already know your type, do you have an inkling of where you might lean more? Then please put that in the chat window now. So from those of you who have already shared it, we have some extroverts and some introverts, so it's really across the line. Okay. Okay. Cruises are a nightmare. Well, there you go. Okay. Good. That means I chose a good example. All right. The next dimension that Jung found was about how we use our brains to gather information and what kind of information we trust. In your MBTI result, this will show up with an S for sensing or an N for intuiting. And you might notice there I have the letters in bold orange. It's N for intuiting because the I was already taken for introversion. Okay. Generally speaking, people with preferences for sensing like and trust factual, practical information. They'll see details first and then perhaps go to build a framework after that. And people with intuiting preferences tend to like and trust general patterns and themes. They like framework first that then can be applied to figure out the details. Okay? And this is where I have to thank Susan Nash, because she showed me that we can go a little further into detail here, because the perceiving function shows up in both attitudes. Okay, so we have extroverted sensing, or SE. That's where we use our 5 senses to truly experience the present moment. And introverted sensing, or SI, where we recall past moments in great detail and again with all our senses. And then we use extroverted intuiting, or NE, when we're brainstorming new possible ideas and alternatives, and introverted intuiting, or NI, that's active when we have visions or flashes of insights that we may not know where they come from, but they're just true. Okay, so again, for those of you who didn't know your preference before, I hope maybe this helped you a little bit in kind of sorting which way you lean. Is it more S or is it more N? And if you're so inclined, feel free to share that in the chat. And we have Sarah likes to go out. That's a good sign for extroversion. Introverts, people with introversion preferences also like to go out, but they probably prefer going out in smaller groups and socializing with more in depth than in breadth. You know, if you're going to a party, people with extroversion preferences are more likely to kind of flutter and maybe chat among a larger group of people, and people with introversion preferences, if they go to the party, they're probably more comfortable chatting with one or two people more in depth and have longer conversations. Okay. Any comments on the sensing and intuiting scale? I'll give you a moment. You start talking to everyone. All right. That's great. Okay. Well, let's move on. Next attitude that Jung looked at was how we make decisions based on the information that we've just taken in, that we've perceived. He called this the judging function, and it shows up either as thinking or feeling. And again, the terms can be a little bit misleading. So thinking does not mean cold, and feeling does not mean emotional necessarily. These are both rational functions and approaches to decision making. In general, people with a thinking preference will use objective criteria and abstract logic, and people with feeling preferences will use subjective criteria and a values-based system to make their decisions. And the judging functions also show up in both attitudes. We have extroverted thinking, or TE, that likes to organize and look for cause and effect, and then introverted thinking, or TI, analyzes the data for what is logical and compares it to an inner model. On the other side, we use extroverted feeling when we're concerned about maintaining harmony and doing what's appropriate, so that's SE. And introverted feeling kicks in when we're basing our decisions on our values and doing what's right according to that inner model. And that would be FI. Again, if you'd like to share your preferences, just go ahead. And these 8 functions, SE, SI, TE, TI, etc., they're the 8 functions that Jung talked about and explored in his work. And to make his work accessible to the general public, the mother-daughter pair of Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers developed the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator. That's the MBTI, a questionnaire that is often used by universities and organizations to help people figure out their type and functions preferences. And in order to do that and see which attitude we use in the perceiving or judging functions, they had to add a dimension that Jung actually probably never talked about. That would be the work-life orientation. That is either judgment or perception, or judging and perception. And just to be clear, J does not mean judgmental, and P does not stand for procrastination, as many people say. This dimension describes which function we show to the world. So if you have a J in your code, that means it's one of the judging functions, either T or F. And if you have a P in your code, that means you show either sensing or perceiving to those around you. And as a consequence, people with a J preference tend to prefer closure and making decisions, doing the judgment portion, where people with a P preference tend to enjoy the process more and gathering information more. Okay. So I hope this wasn't too confusing, but I did want to make sure that when we talk about type, we're referring to the underlying theory by Jung. The MBTI is a great tool to help you decode your type preferences, but often it's used synonymously, and that's where we see people getting stuck with labels. Okay, so it often happens that people say, oh, he's a thinker or she's a sensor. And that's just a drawn language. When we're talking about functions, we should always try and using the ing form, as we've seen here, thinking, feeling, sensing, etc. Because they're processes. They're always in motion, and they're adaptable to the context. From the neuroscience correlation, I have just one slide here to show, because what we've talked about here, these preferences and these functions, are just basically based on Jung's theories and observations. But more recently, Dr. Dario Nardi actually strapped an EEG device onto about 6 students. And he was able to measure and see in real time how people use their brains differently, and he found correlations to the 8 functions. So the red areas you see on the screen there, that's the prefrontal cortex, and dominant judging types will use the left prefrontal cortex a bit more, and dominant perceiving types will use the right hand side a little bit more. And if you are interested in learning more about that and seeing how maybe your brain works and doing a self-assessment of which functions you are most comfortable using, then you can drop me an email at doris@buildinglifeyouwant.com, and I'll send you a link to the neuroscience assessment. Okay? I just love this slide because there's actual factual data and research now that really shows that it's not just theory. You can, Sarah would like to, that's great. Yeah, send me an email and then I'll send you the login details after the session, okay? So moving on, just to the type preference in action, here's a little exercise for you. If you lead a group of 25 people and you have 2 tickets for an all expenses paid trip to Hawaii to give out, how do you decide who gets them? So those of you with a thinking preference, if you could go first, please use the chat window. How do you make a decision of distributing 2 tickets among 25 people? And I'll read the chat as the answers come in. Random drawing is one. Ask them to make a presentation and explain why I should send them. Okay. There's that cause and effect thinking, right? If you deserve it, you have to work for it. See how it works. Any other people with a T preference would like to share? Really depends on the situation, absolutely. If there's someone who's made a particularly strong contribution recently, you'd probably give it to them. Okay. And this is a good example for what might be a cultural preference showing through. Asking how important it is for them to go. Who is going to give the benefit back? Okay. So those of you with a feeling preference, how would you make a decision? The one who you like more, the 2 who need it more. Maybe a raffle, but then maybe based on some community service activity, okay? Yeah. So you see there's a personal subjective element to it, right? So the deserving portion for somebody with a T preference might be based on who has worked hardest for it. And for someone with an F preference for feeling, the deserving might be more if they maybe have had death in the family, or if they've had a hard time and need to unwind and relax a little bit. When I've done this exercise in groups, it was really interesting because the thinking groups were done in 2 seconds, because basically they said, well, we'll put the names in a bowl and then see who gets drawn. And the people with the feeling preference usually take a lot more time to try and attribute the winning tickets to those who are more deserving, according to their criteria. Okay, let's have a quick look at the Q&A. If you have any pressing questions coming up, I didn't see any come in though. Any questions about this part so far? What is my type? Ah, that's a good question. I'll tell you at the end. And I don't see any Q&A other than that coming in. Remind me of that, so I'll tell you at the end. Okay, well, let's move on. Diversity. Let's switch gears a little bit. When I say diversity, you think, and again, please use that window. When I say diversity, what do you think? Do you get the presentation in the end? I can make the slide available to those of you who signed up, yes. Okay, and we have a second request here, the emails of the other participants if they agree. Well, let's keep that to the end. I'll ask you about that permission at the end, okay? So when I say diversity, what comes to mind? Nationalities, various nationalities, different people with different backgrounds, experiences, and cultures. The question is, what are you thinking of? What do you think of when you hear the word diversity? So race, nationality, gender, age, education, sexuality, people's unique capabilities, nationalities, yeah, culture, absolutely. So we'll be talking here about national diversity and cultural diversity. Values, of course, plays into that. Thank you. But Regula is right. There's also diversity in terms of gender, age, sexual preferences, physical ability, or ethnicity. They're definitely important factors here in the United States as well. But the funny thing is that there is no universally agreed upon definition of diversity. In fact, the word does not even have an equivalent in some languages, and neither do many of the related terms, like the affirmative action or equal opportunity and political correctness and everything. So that is a very US-centric approach, and it's challenging to go beyond that, because if you take this US-centric approach of inclusion and equal opportunity into other countries that don't even have a word for it, then there's a problem right there, right? So while type describes how we use our brain in certain behaviors, which also means that we have inherent talents and blind spots, culture looks at how we behave according to norms and values and belief systems. Okay, so that's not necessarily introvert feeling, it's the norms and belief systems in the group that we grow up with. So we're driven by what's important to us, and culture usually develops over time. So there are many different definitions of culture, and what makes most sense to me is to think that people did what they had to in order to survive, to preserve their species and save their families and not get eaten by tigers, okay? Or midges if you grow up in Scotland, because they eat you up as well. So culture is behavior we've learned from our parents because it makes sense, and a lot of it is based on the geography and the surroundings where we grew up. If you just think of countries in the northern hemisphere, where you have only so many hours of sunlight, so the attitude to time is completely different than what you'd see in the South. And one way to think about culture is it's like an onion. It has many layers, and the more you peel away, the more it makes you cry, right? But okay, so the more you get to the core. And another way of thinking about culture is that it's an iceberg. And so this should be the iceberg slide now, regular, if you want to refresh. And what do we know of an iceberg? Only 10% are visible of the top. So above the waterline, we can observe what a culture is, if you translate this into culture, how it is lived in the different countries. We see language, we see attitude to authority, customs and rituals. And if we're brave, especially the expats among us, if we're brave and ask questions, you can peer onto the waterline and get to understand what's right below the surface. For instance, you can ask, if you're in China, why do they give out red envelopes for New Year's? Or how come Americans are celebrating Labor Day in September, you know? So the deeper we dive underneath that waterline, the more we get to why those behaviors on top and why those cultural preferences on top are being displayed. And venturing below this waterline also allows us to understand the values and the underlying beliefs and the concepts that have shaped the people of that particular culture and our own as well. Because here's the thing, we don't usually think about our own cultural programming until we're asked about it, because we don't have to. Why would we? Growing up where we do, with everybody growing up with the same belief systems and they're raised with similar values, their behavior is the same, so we get used to our definition of normal and no longer notice it. Okay? So for example, for an American, it's very common to eat a quick sandwich at their desk for lunch. And in Spain, for example, it's very common to take at least an hour or so for lunch to go outside and sit and socialize in a big group. And so the behavior would be eat alone or eat in a group. And I've worked with Mexican clients who came to the States who felt very sorry for that American sitting at their desk, thinking, oh, he must have no friends, the poor guy. Okay? And later they understood that it was more about getting the job done, about being efficient and not wasting time. And likewise, I've worked with American clients who thought the Spaniards were lazy, taking such long breaks in the middle of the day when they should be working, until eventually they understood that these team lunches helped open informal communication channels and establish trust and really help the teamwork in the long run. So looking at the behavior and thinking that's different, therefore that's weird, is natural. But if you go below the surface and below this waterline, then you can try and understand why it happened and see the reasons for it. So how would you explain your culture to a Martian, right? I'd like you to start thinking about that and just become a little more aware of your own cultural preferences, because sometimes when you're talking with someone from another culture and you don't know what's going on underneath the surface, you can feel like this guy stuck on a little piece of ice, floating, lost at sea. Okay, but that's where this training basically and raised awareness comes in. So let's move into the cultural programs. This is an overview of the 7 cultural dimensions that Fons Trompenaars and Charles Hampton Turner found during their research of international managers in the 1990s. Their book is called Writing the Ways of Culture, as you see there. They've recently actually published the 3rd edition. We won't have time to go over all 7 dimensions, but we'll look at a few of them. And again, just as a reminder, please keep in mind that no one person, no one country is only always on one side of the extreme. We're all fluctuating along the lines of the continuum depending on the context that we're in. Okay? So, for example, the universalism and particularism dimension looks at rules. Every society has rules, every country has rules, but the cultural difference is in how consistently these rules are enforced. universalist countries, everyone's treated the same because it's more about the task. In particularist countries, we often see exceptions being made because it's more about the relationship. Okay, so the example question is, imagine you're riding as a passenger with your friend is driving, he's driving the car way over the speed limit and hits another car. The police arrives and your friend asks you to lie for him and say he wasn't speeding. Would you lie for your friend? And this is where I'd ask you again to use the chat. We have a couple of no's. We have a yes. We have a couple more people. Okay, couple of no's. But there's a yes in there as well. So there we go. Maybe depends on the friendship, absolutely. But Janet, you're thinking about it though. You know, for many it's not that clear cut. Like I said, it's not the extreme. It's usually somewhere in the middle. Here's what the research showed. Broadly speaking, Western countries tend to prefer universalism, and in the South and East, particularism is a little more the norm. Okay, so this dimension is easily confused with thinking or feeling decision-making from the type framework that we've looked at before. But somebody from Venezuela who has a thinking preference will still think it's fair to save a friend from jail, and a Swiss or a German person with a feeling preference will still not lie because the rules should be enforced. They might feel bad about it though, because they'd like the harmony and see the friendship in jeopardy, but they still wouldn't lie. Okay? So this is where the invitation is for you to think about which would overrule, would your type overrule or would your cultural preference overrule? Because the follow-up question is this. You're riding in a car with your friend, he is speeding, and he hits a little girl on a bike. Police arrives and he asks you to lie for him and say that he wasn't speeding. Now would you lie or would you not? Because sometimes it can go either way, right? Some people are more inclined to say, well, no, if a little girl gets hurt, if there's personal injury involved, then I will not lie if they were on the fence. And sometimes you can also find a sway more towards the other side where they say, well, now that the consequences are even more dire, of course I would be more inclined to lie for him because he's my friend and I don't want him to go to jail. Right? So, something to think about. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. But for now, let's move on. This is the specific and diffuse dimension. Regular, it would depend on the consequences for the two. Which one's worse? And you rarely find yourself in these kind of situations. You think that too is a TS thing to some extent. Absolutely. Okay, yeah, it's the lines are blurry. Yeah, okay. Sorry, so how far are we going to evolve? The specific and diffuse dimension, this is looking at what is open and what is public and how we view friendships. And this is something I had to learn coming to the States, because the peach and the coconut example is taken from Kurt Lewensberg. He was a German scientist who moved to the UK and then on to the US, and basically he said that America can be compared to peaches. Okay? Their outer layer, that fleshy bit that you see there, is quite soft and easy to get into. And we see that in the people because they smile a lot, they're usually quite friendly and easy to get to know, and they do a lot of small talk, for example. So their outer layer is easily segmented into pieces as well. So for an American, there would be a work piece and a gym piece and a church piece and a piece for Toastmasters or other hobbies or whatever. And then in the center, they have that core family and friends. And those outside segments are really quite easy to get into, though. Okay? And the Germans, on the other hand, are more like coconuts. We see that outer shell is a lot thinner. It's a lot thicker, so it's much harder to get into. People use formal language and greetings when you first meet someone. There's not a lot of small talk, and Germans don't usually smile that much either. Okay. However, once you've broken that shell, if you're persistent and consistently tapping and trying a couple of times, once that breaks open, you're invited to the whole life, and you have a friendship covering all different areas. This cultural difference is important to know, especially for expats, because there may be misunderstandings. Just because an American is friendly to you at work, it doesn't necessarily mean they want to hang out or go to the cinema afterwards. Okay? And just because it takes longer to get to know a German doesn't mean it's not worth it. So specific and diffuse can be mistaken for sensing and intuiting preferences, but remember that these functions actually describe the type of information that we are drawn to and that we trust. So sensing with the specifics and intuiting with the overall. It's a cultural difference here that changes how we express our type depending on how we are. And there's somebody who did some research on that not too long ago. And you have the quote here. It's from an article called Culture Wires the Brain, a cognitive neuroscience perspective. And basically, they say that East Asian and Western cultures have different biases for processing information that result from contrast in cultural values and beliefs. And the example that they came up with last year, or early this year even, is in the Facebook profile pictures. So they said that American or Westernized cultures would be much more focused on headshots, and that Asian cultures, collectivist cultures, would be much more focused on a larger background. So they actually sat people in front of a computer and did the retina measurement thing where they showed pictures and tracked the eye movement. And for American students, the eye went straight to the center of the picture onto a face of a person. And the eye movement for Asian students went more around the central figure and around the faces toward the background. So these are pictures from my American friends on Facebook. There's a German in there as well. If you're in the Thai community, you might recognize a couple of them. And here are some pictures from some friends with an Asian background. And I know that at least one of you recognizes one of those pictures, but we'll leave that anonymous, okay? The invitation would be for you to go check out your Facebook now and see if you find the same. So the research that Tromp and Larson have did, one of the questions was, would you help paint your boss's house on the weekend? And, you can see that for yourself. The explanations we've given up to now, see where you fall kind of on the continuum. Here's what the research showed. Again, broadly speaking, Northwestern countries, it's unlikely that they would give up their weekend just to help out the boss. But in Southern and Eastern countries, it might actually be seen as mandatory to maintain the friendly relationship that you have. So when I gave this presentation at my local Association of Psychological Type, easy for me to say, Association for Psychological Type chapter, we've had a couple of Chinese students in the room, and they just nodded and said, well, yes, my boss asked me, then I would do it. And Okay, so I'm sorry. We've been changing slides now. For those of you who have to refresh your browser, please do that. And we have a comment here that the American boss would not ask, it would be improper. And that's exactly what I said when I was first asked about would I lie for my friend. I said my friend in Germany, my German friend would not ask me to lie for them. So yes, there's a definite cultural bias there. Any other comments, questions? How are we doing so far? Do you guys see the meeting temperature down there? Do you want to move that for me and let me know if I'm going okay? Speed okay? Content okay? Little more, little less, little faster? Okay. We're lukewarm. All right. Culture stuff is good. Let's keep going then. All righty. So one final example, the orientation to self and others. To illustrate the cultural differences, this is the individualism and communitarianism dimension. They describe whether the culture encourages and focuses attention more on the individual or more on the group. That's okay, the thing is supposed to slide back. Yeah. All right. So this group that can be a family or an organization, and the respondents had to agree or disagree with this statement. Quality of life will improve if everyone has maximum freedom and opportunity for self-development. If you want to mentally put yourself on that continuum where you will fall somewhere in the middle, more to the left, more to the right, this is what the research showed. And they might easily be mistaken for extroversion and introversion preferences. So I've clicked now that the slide should show the flags and their corresponding percentage results. Okay. So for not all individualists are introverts and not all communitarianists are extroverts, on the contrary. Extroversion and introversion looks at where your mental energy goes and where your mental energy flows and how you recharge your batteries. And the individualism and communitarianism dimension looks at who is important to us, who is our core group, who do we focus on, how do we orient ourselves to the individual and to the group. So people, again, this is a little more fluctuated, but usually Germany is kind of in the middle there. For example, we have a long-standing history of social security and unemployment benefits and healthcare. So that is just something that is in the culture of the people because we're used to it. And there is a belief there that quality of life will improve for everyone if we take care of one another. Okay, that would be the opposite belief there. So here's where type and culture come together, though. There are 7 billion people on the planet. There are over 195 countries. And those are the national cultures. There are countless subcultures, of course. And then we all fall into 16 type patterns and 8 cognitive function preferences. And yet type research shows that the most common type, and I'm forwarding here to show the flags and the types and the percentages, is ESTJ. Okay. Now, statistics can be manipulated, just so you know. The sample sizes for the MBTI research here weren't representative for all of the countries. I think the USA, this is not based on host data. This is based on the Myers-Briggs results. People who have taken the Myers-Briggs assessment in those countries, and then CPP, I believe, has made research and collected the data and said how many percentages of those respondents came out with this particular type. And ESTJ happens to be the type that is the most common among all those countries that we've looked at. Okay, the US and the UK are the only one who have a true national sample that would be representative across all age groups and genders and employment types. For the other countries, Germany, India, China, and Mexico here, it was mainly managers. So there's the professional bias, if you will, that more managers seem to have ESTJ preferences because that skill set just goes with being in the higher echelons of a society. But still, I hope that the previous slides together have shown that although you might meet many ESTJs, no matter where you go, you can't expect every ESTJ to behave the same, especially if they come from different cultures, because the expression of type across cultures is exactly what makes it's so rich and what really shows the individuality and the uniqueness of the people. Okay, this is something that I'm trying to find out with research that I'm doing. So if you'll indulge me, I have an invitation here for you before we wrap up and before we go into the resources and look at that Q&A again. I'm looking here at how our personality type influences cultural adaptation and how expats prepare for their assignments and adapt to the new surroundings once they get to the new country. So some of you might have seen that before. I've publicized this on LinkedIn as well, but if you haven't done so already, I would invite you to go to expatmbti.com, fill out the 5 questions, and if you leave your email address, I'll follow up with an interview to get more details. And I'd also be grateful if you could share this with your friends and other expats that you would know, because as you can see, I'm missing ISFJ, ISFP, and ESFJ. I've had 3 or 4 follow-up interviews by now. Most of them were NT temperaments, theorist temperaments, but I would like to get a good distribution across all types and then have the follow-up interviews to really find representative results. Okay, all right. So we're almost ready for the wrap-up here. What would be your takeaway from these slides and from this presentation? I'll give you a moment to put that in the chat window, please. Have you seen something you didn't know before? Anything new in there? Anything helpful in there? The alignment of the 7 dimensions with how it relates to type. Okay. New and very interesting. Great. Interesting statistic on type distributions in different countries. Thank you. Fascinating to see how type and culture interact. Thank you. When conducting MBTI trainings in different countries, absolutely. There is a booklet called Type and Culture. The 2nd edition is well worth the purchase. Peach and coconut concept is useful. Thank you. I thought so too. And there's a failed to link culture in MBTI. Okay. Well, we might be able to talk some more offline about that. Okay. Well, what I hope to have shown is that for me, when type meets culture, magic happens. Okay? And an understanding and maybe even some more appreciation for diversity. Because coming from a type background, we are aware and encouraging of our type preferences, but type doesn't explain everything. And what I hope to, and those of us who are cross-cultural trainers, we know about the cultural dimensions and how people behave differently according to what their values are. But sometimes that is not prescriptive either, because we are so complex that there are more factors that play into the game. Okay, so what I hope to have shown is that how people within the same culture behave differently according to how their brains are wired, because they may have different types, even though they're all German or they're all Chinese, and that how people behave differently across cultures according to which value system they learn. So they still might be all ESTJs, but if they're in a particularist society, they will choose to lie for their friend. And if they're grown up in a universalist society, they will probably choose not to lie for their friend. Okay. And again, an invitation to the next steps for you guys. If you want to go to expatsmbti.com, do fill out the questions, share with your friends, and then we can connect on LinkedIn. You can like the company Building the Life You Want LLC on Facebook, if you're so inclined. If you have a profile on Facebook as well, we can connect. If you'd like to drop me a line, just giving me some feedback about what you thought of the webinar, or have any questions or follow-up comments, then you can do that at doris@buildingthelifeyouwant.com. And if you're really interested in this stuff and want to stay connected and find out about more of these webinars that I intend to put up, you can go to buildingthelifeyouwant.com/blog and sign up for the newsletter. So I'd love to hear what you thought. And I do want to respect your privacy, though, so I don't intend to spam anyone just because you signed up for this one webinar, okay? If you want to find out about more webinars, then you'd have to opt in. And there was a question about sharing the participants' email addresses with everyone else. The slides, I will put the slides out. Yes, thank you. Some of you had difficulty seeing all of them. I will make the recording available as well, crossing fingers that worked out properly. Oh, my type. Yes, I am a German ENFJ. So I have preferences for extroversion, intuiting, feeling, and judging. That means that my dominant function is extroverted feeling. That's my go-to. I like harmony. I like to anticipate other people's needs. That's why I really like the comment that was made before, that there was good interactivity, because my main goal is to serve you guys and make sure that everybody gets what they came for. Okay. Here is the overview of the resources that I've put together. These are the books and publications that I've referenced. Gifts Differing is Isabel Myers' book, 1980. This is very go into the basics and just really insightful. And then the neuroscience, of course, is very interesting as well. Oh, I don't have Linda Behrens on here. Linda Behrens, Dr. Linda Behrens, lindabehrens.com. She's also very influential on me and has great research and great knowledge into how different areas of type come together. And you see the culture references there as well. Writing the Ways of Culture from Trompenaars, and FIGT.org, where I've met some of you before. So maybe we can connect there next year. And let me see if I have any more Q&As. I don't think I do. I'll give you a moment to put those comments in, those questions in, if you have them. But we are at the top of the hour, and I do want to respect your time. I'll stay on for another couple of minutes to see if any more questions come in. But otherwise, it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much for signing up and for participating. I will get the slides to you. And if you guys give me permission, then I will share your email addresses with the other participants as well. And other than that, have a great day. And I hope to connect with you again on these other outlets and see you again soon. Thank you. Thank you guys for the great feedback.